The Oathbreakers are one of Middle-earth's most enigmatic and terrifying aspects. Little has been written about them, and even what we have is shrouded in mystery. In this video we will dive into the story of these forgotten people. The tale of the Oathbreakers begins in the middle of the Second Age, with the Men of the Mountains. These men were a group of Brynnumenorians that had settled at the western end of the White Mountains, around the river Morfond. The Brynnumenorians were those men who dwelt in the Westlands, but weren't descendants of Numenor. Unlike the Edain, the Brynnumenorians had not fought against Morgoth during the First Age, though they also hadn't served him. For much of the age, the Men of the Mountains flourished and increased in numbers. They were dark-haired, dark-skinned, and shorter than other men. Although they built no great cities, preferring instead to live in scattered villages at the foothills of the mountains, they were ruled by a king. The men also controlled the pass in the White Mountains beneath the Dwimmelberg, which led from Dunharrow to the Blackroot Vale. And in return of the king, it is also suggested that it were they who first built Dunharrow, though to what purpose, as a town, a secret temple, or a tomb of kings, none could say. During the Dark Years, the years between the forging of the One Ring and the founding of Arnor and Gondor, when the peoples of Middle-earth suffered greatly under Sauron's dominion, the Men of the Mountains actually worshipped him. And in Tolkien's own words, the Men of Darkness built temples, some of great size, usually surrounded by dark trees, often in caverns, natural or delved, in secret valleys of the mountain ranges, such as the dreadful halls and passages under the haunted mountain beyond the Dark Gate in Dunharrow. This devotion would come to an end after the founding of Gondor. Isildur, co-king with his brother Anarion, gained the allegiance of the king of the Men of the Mountains. One of the heirlooms that the Dunedain had brought from Numenor was a great black spherical stone. Isildur set the stone on a hill named Erech, near the source of the Morfond. Upon the top of the hill stood a black stone, round as a great globe, the height of a man, though its half was buried in the ground. Unearthly it looked, as though it had fallen from the sky, as some would later believe. The king of the Men of the Mountains would swear an oath to Isildur upon that stone that he and his people would fight against Sauron should he return. Relationships between the two sides appear to have been full of mistrust, as Minas Anor, later known as Minas Tirith, was originally raised as a shield against the wild men of the Dales. This lack of trust could have been the reason as to why Isildur made the king commit himself to an oath. Unbeknownst to them all, Sauron did secretly return, and in 3429 he attacked Gondor with great strength. Isildur's city of Minas Ithil was captured, and the White Tree burned. Isildur himself managed to escape and returned to the Stone of Erech, summoning the Men of the Mountains to fulfill their oath. But they would not fight against their former master, and instead the king broke the oath. Then Isildur said, "Thou shalt be the last king, and if the West prove mightier than thy black master, this curse I lay upon thee and thy folk, to rest never until your oath is fulfilled. For this war shall last through years uncounted, and you shall be summoned once again ere the end." And they fled before the wrath of Isildur, and did not dare to go forth to war on Sauron's side. The years passed, and the faithless people were forgotten. Sauron was defeated, though not vanquished, and Isildur's curse came into effect. The men withdrew in their underground temples, hiding themselves in secret places and having no dealings with other men. Slowly they dwindled in the barren hills, but bound by the curse, their spirits were unable to leave the circles of the world when they died, and were forced to linger as wraiths, haunting their old halls. Thus the passage through the mountains, where the Oathbreakers now resided, became known as the Paths of the Dead, a place of fear and horror. The hill on which the Stone of Erech had been set was also said to have been haunted, and was avoided by those Gondorians who lived in the Blackroot Vale. You may be wondering, how was Isildur able to curse an entire people? In Tolkien's works, oaths have power, and breaking one can have serious consequences. It could be that this oath was sworn on the name of Eru Ilúvatar, the god of Middle-earth, and when it was broken, Isildur did not actually curse the man himself, but rather appealed to Iluvatar to punish them. Or even more likely was that the men of the mountains swore their oath and then called upon the everlasting darkness to take them should they break it, much like how the oath of Feanor happened. Regardless, not all of the men became wraiths at once. There is some evidence for them still existing well into the Third Age. When the elven king Amroth of Lorien and his beloved Nimrodel lost one another in the White Mountains in 1981 of the Third Age, Amroth managed to make his way to the haven of Ethelond. There, the elves claimed that the men of Gondor would help Nimrodel should they find her, but also that in the mountains were many unfriendly men and evil things. The evil things which they were referring to were likely the wraiths of the Oathbreakers, and those unfriendly men could have been those who still survived, lingering in their holes like savages and waiting for death to finally take them. A few centuries before, during the reign of King Arvedui of Arthedain, a seer named Malbeth foretold of a day when one of Arvedui's descendants would come to the paths of the dead. Over the land there lies a long shadow, westward reaching wings of darkness. The tower trembles, to the tombs of kings doom approaches. The dead awaken, for the hour is come for the Oathbreakers. At the stone of Erech shall they stand again, and hear there a horn in the hills ringing. Whose shall the horn be? Who shall call them from the great twilight? The forgotten people. The heir of him to whom the oath they swore. From the north shall he come, need shall drive him. He shall pass the door of the paths of the dead. None likely knew then of whom the seer spoke, and the kingdom of Arthedain fell not long after. After the founding of Rohan, the second king, Brego, began to seek strong places of refuge for his people in time of need. One night he and his eldest son, Baldur, came upon a dark gate while they were exploring Dunharrow. Little did they know that that was the entrance to the paths of the dead. The horses would not pass the threatening stone until the riders dismounted and led them about. And so they came at last deep into the glen, and there stood a sheer wall of rock, and in the wall was a dark door gaped before them like the mouth of night. Signs and figures were carved about its wide arch, too dim to read, and fear flowed from the gate like a grey vapor. On the threshold sat an old man, aged beyond guess of years. Tall and kingly he had been, but now he was withered as an old stone. Indeed, for stone they took him, for he moved not, and he said no word until they sought to pass him by and enter. And then a voice came out of him, as it were out of the ground, and to their amaze it spoke in the western tongue. The way is shut. They halted and looked at him and saw that he lived still, but he did not look at them. The way is shut, his voice said again. It was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it, until the time comes. The way is shut. And when will that time be? Said Baldur. But no answer did he ever get, for the old man died in that hour and fell upon his face. When Brego raised the golden hall of Meduseld, he gave a great feast to hallow it. At that feast Baldur vowed to walk the paths of the dead, and the following year he passed beyond the dark door in the mountains. None ever saw him again, and Brego died of grief at the loss of his eldest son. In those caverns did Baldur also meet his end, coming to a closed door. The special horror of that door before which the skeleton of Baldur was found was probably due to the fact that the door was the entrance to an evil temple hall, to which Baldur had come, probably without opposition up to that point. But the door was shut in his face, and the enemies which had followed him silently came up and broke his legs, and left him there to die in the darkness, unable to find any way out. After this, none dared to even approach the entrance to the paths, but in the end the words of Malbeth the seer would be proven right. During the War of the Ring, when the Rohirrim were mustering at Dunharrow before the siege of Gondor, some reinforcements arrived from the north. This was the Grey Company, a group of 30 Dunedain rangers, and the sons of Elrond, Eladan and Elrohir. The two half-elves reminded Aragorn of Malbeth's prophecy and encouraged him to take the paths of the dead. Aragorn, who had already looked into the Palantir of Orthanc, knew that a fleet of corsairs and Haradrim was preparing to invade Gondor's southern fiefdoms, and knew that if Minas Tirith were to survive the upcoming battle, that threat needed to be removed. On March 7th, the heir of Isildur, together with Legolas, Gimli, and the Grey Company, passed beyond the mountain entrance and began the crossing of the passage. They could see nothing in the dim flame of the torches, but if the company halted, there seemed an endless whisper of voices all about them, a murmur of words in no tongue that they had ever heard before. Nothing assailed them or withstood their passage, but they knew that all the paths behind were fraught by an unseen host that followed them in the dark. Soon they came upon the corpse of Baldur himself. Before him were the bones of a mighty man. He had been clad in mail, and still his hardness lay there foul, for the cavern's air was as dry as the dust. His belt was of gold and garnets, and rich with gold was the helm upon his bony head face, downward on the floor. He had fallen near the far wall of the cave, as now could be seen, and before him stood a stony door closed fast. His finger bones were still clawing at the cracks. A notched and broken sword lay by him, as if he had hewn the rock in his last despair. At midnight the Grey Company came out of the tunnel and reached the Stone of Erech. The dead followed, invisible to all but the three elves. Some shades went on foot, whilst others on horses, with pale banners like shreds of cloud, and spears like winter frosts. All around, men locked themselves in their houses, or ran wildly to escape the fear which the strangers brought with them. No other sound they heard, and yet they were aware of a great host gathering all about the hill on which they stood. A chill wind like the breath of ghosts came down from the mountains. But Aragorn dismounted, and standing by the stone, he cried in a great voice, "The hour is come at last. Now I go to Pelargir upon Anduin, and ye shall come after me. And when all this land is clean of the servants of Sauron, I will hold your oath fulfilled, and ye shall have rest and peace, and depart forever. For I am Elessar, Isildur's heir of Gondor." The company then rode across Gondor's fiefdoms, bringing terror to friends and foes alike. When they arrived at the town of Linhir, they saw that it was under attack by the Haradrim, but the presence of the King of the Dead drove them away. Only Angbor the Fearless, Lord of Lamedon, could withstand the dread of the Wraith army. Aragorn bade Angbor gather his men and follow him. Soon they reached Pelargir, and found it overwhelmed by the corsairs. There lay the main fleet of Umbar, 50 great ships and smaller vessels beyond count. Many of those that we pursued had reached the havens before us, and brought their fear with them, and some of the ships had put off, seeking to escape down the river or to reach the far shore, and many of the smaller craft were ablaze. But the Haradrim turned at bay, and they laughed when they looked upon us, for they were still a great army. But Aragorn halted and cried with a great voice, "Now come, by the black stone I call you." And suddenly the shadow host that had hung back at last came upon like a great tide, sweeping all away before it. Faint cries I heard, and dim horns blowing, and a murmur as the countless far voices. It was like the echo of some forgotten battle in the dark years long ago. Pale swords were drawn, but I know not whether their blades would still bite, for the dead needed no longer any weapon but fear. None would withstand them. To every ship they came that was drawn up, and then they passed over the water to those that were anchored, and all of the mariners were filled with a madness of terror, and leaped overboard, save for the slaves chained to the oars. The shadow host then withdrew to the shore. There they stood silent, hardly to be seen, save for a red gleam in their eyes. And Aragorn spoke in a loud voice to the dead men, crying, "Hear now the words of the heir of Isildur. Your oath is fulfilled. Go back and trouble no longer the Vales. Depart and be at rest." And thereupon the King of the Dead, the same one that had broken the oath to Isildur over 3,000 years ago, stood up before the host and broke his spear and cast it down. Then he bowed low and turned away, and swiftly the whole grey host drew off and vanished like a mist that is driven back by a sudden wind. With the corsair ships, Aragorn and his men were able to make their way to Minas Tirith, turning the tide of the Battle of Pelennor Fields and coming one step closer to Sauron's defeat.